Okay, so now we're going to talk about Noam Chomsky's critique of behaviorism and transformational grammar. So back in the 50s, 1950s, B.F. Skinner, following the tradition of behaviorism, argued that language is learned or acquired through basic principles of association and reinforcement. So, for example, association would be when you say the word peanut, and then the word butter usually follows. And so you start saying bunnet, bunnet. You start saying butter after peanut. And the idea is that the chaining of words in this, and the idea is that this chaining of words is how sentences get formed. Uh, yeah, so the chaining is, and the chaining is based on how likely a word is to follow another word. And then for reinforcement, if I said the right thing when I communicated to my parents as a kid, did they reinforce it with a reward, or did they punish or correct me? That's the idea. So if I said something correctly, the idea is that I would might get a reward, but if I said something incorrectly, they might punish or correct me. And B.F. Skinner would say uh, that all language is acquired by uh, association and reinforcement. Okay. And so, like, just to sort of reinforce this idea, no pun intended, the idea is that each subsequent word in a sentence is based on probabilities, which are based on previously created associations and reinforcement. And you can think of this as like when you write an email or write a text message. The program often suggests what the next word is that you should use based on probabilities of how that language is structured and how people talk. And that's basically the idea, right? That's how B.F. Skinner said that's how we learn language in a very similar fashion, right? Or a somewhat similar fashion. And Noam Chomsky very much disagreed with this. In a nutshell, he's saying that the ability to acquire language is somewhat innate, or at least we have some sort of innate ability to understand and acquire the rules of a given language. So Noam Chomsky laid out a bunch of problems with the idea that B.F. Skinner was arguing. And so now here are some of the problems, right? So one of the problems is that understanding long distance dependencies requires knowledge of abstract rules. What does that mean, right? So imagine if the sentence was, the books were old, right? We would call this a short distance dependency because there's no distance between the subject and the verb, right? They're back to back. And the idea is that the next word in a sentence is based on probability, which is based on association and reinforcement. So that idea itself can probably explain short distance dependency. It can probably explain how we would acquire that or be able to learn that sentence. But when you have a number of words that intervene the subject and verb in a sentence, we would call that a long distance dependency because the verb is dependent, in this case, the verb uh, were is dependent on the subject books, but there's a longer distance between them. In order to explain such long distance dependencies, there needs to be some sort of rule-based representation, and therefore speakers must have some knowledge of these grammatical rules. So I wanted to say, so simple models that try to predict the next word in a sentence have a lot of trouble with long distance dependencies. Whereas if you have a rule-based representation, it naturally explains how we would acquire this or say this or learn this sentence. But as a side note, I'm not going to test you on this, but as a side note, it turns out that with neural networks, which we'll talk about, so ChatGPT uses what's called a neural network. And with neural networks, you can actually you can get a computer program to generate long sentences with long distance dependencies without actually knowing the rule-based representation of the sentence or the language. So I just wanted to say that as a side note. But at the time, prior to neural networks or prior to the resurgence of neural networks, it was really difficult to get a model, a simple chaining associationistic model to explain long distance dependencies. Okay, another problem with B.F. Skinner's argument is that children commonly utter sentences that would have been unlikely to be created using simple association and reinforcement. And if you ever talk to a toddler, they say weird things, okay? So, in fact, Bill Cosby, before all the scandals, he had a TV show a long time ago where he would talk to kids and kids would say weird things to him, right? And the title of the show was Kids Say the Darndest Things, right? And these utterances are interesting from a linguistic perspective because it's unlikely that an adult taught them to say that. They probably didn't utter some weird sentence that somebody else said, right? Because they're weird. They're weird sentences, so by nature, people don't usually say them. As a result, it would be weird if a kid. It's unlikely that a kid learned that sentence from hearing it from an older adult. It's more likely that the children organically came up with that sentence. And so the idea is that there would be no reinforcement or association involved in the creation of that sentence. And Noam Chomsky uses a pretty clever example to illustrate this, which is the sentence, uh, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. And so the idea is that, what's the probability of green of following colorless? So you hear colorless, what's the probability of green following it? It's probably zero. Colorless green, maybe not zero, but it's pretty close to, it's very weird to say colorless green. And then the idea, and then can ideas be a colorless green? Usually ideas don't have a color associated with them, so that's probably zero or at least very close to zero. And then again, do ideas sleep? No, not really. I mean, you probably haven't heard that ideas sleep. Uh, and then finally, do you can you s- can a colorless green idea sleep furiously? I guess you can, at least people maybe can sleep furiously, but you probably haven't heard that very often, right? So the sort of conditional probability of the next word coming up in that sentence is zero. Nevertheless, this is a totally grammatical sentence, and children, right, they could feasibly come up with some weird sentence like this where the probability of that sentence it has to be somewhere around zero. Okay, and then another problem is called the poverty of stimulus problem, which is that the amount of linguistic input is insufficient to explain a child's ability to learn language based on simple behaviorist principles. So this is an issue that's going to pop up a lot in this class, which is, you know, the amount of the stimulus, the amount of information that children are exposed to underdetermines their knowledge of language. So if you were to look at the amount of linguistic input that a child's exposed to, if you were to use that and try to predict their knowledge of what knowledge of that language, you would find that it would underestimate the amount of language that they learned. And this suggests that we have innate knowledge or linguistic rules. And this doesn't mean that we are born with the ability to speak a language, right? We are born with the ability to learn a language. And obviously, we need some sort of input. We need some linguistic input. But the idea is that our minds are probably kind of fine-tuned, if you will, to learn these rules, or maybe we have the rules already. That's also a possibility, and that we're just trying to pair them with the language itself. Uh, and then as a side note, well, it's not quite a side note, but it's we'll see, but it's kind of a side note, is that parents often do not correct grammatical mistakes. So if I were to see a dog and say, I go pet the dog, where I should say I went to pet the dog, right? So I go to pet the dog versus I went to pet the dog. A parent would not correct that grammatical mistake. So if my toddler said, I go to pet the dog, I as a parent would be unlikely to correct that grammatical mistake. I wouldn't say to my toddler, I wouldn't say, it's I went to pet the cat. Or sorry, I went to pet the dog, right? Um, so a parent is unlikely to correct a grammatical mistake or an error in verb conjugation, right? Uh, but but if I were to say, if sorry, if the toddler said, I went to pet the cat, the parent would be more likely to say, no, that's a dog, not a cat, right? And so that tells us that parents correct semantic mistakes, but not grammatical mistakes, which is weird. If language was acquired through association and reinforcement, you would expect parents to correct grammatical mistakes as well as semantic mistakes. Okay. The other problem that um, is that the speed at which children learn language is too fast to explain a language acquisition from a behaviorist perspective, right? So a an association and reinforcement, just using those mechanisms, would predict that acquisition of language would take longer, much longer than it actually does in the real world. And then finally, another thing is that children make consistent and predictable errors. So this is kind of what I was saying before, which is that children will say goad, Goed, right, instead of went, right? They're supposed to say if they want to say I went somewhere, right? You're not supposed to say I goed somewhere, to go somewhere in the past, you wouldn't say goed, you would say went. But the fact that children say goed instead of went, or I doed instead of I did, this suggests that they're overgeneralizing a grammatical rule that they in fact picked up. So nobody tells them to say, this is another thing, right? If no one told them to say goed instead of went, but nevertheless they say goed, suggesting that they are learning the grammatical rules or they have the grammatical rules in place and they're sort of overgeneralizing them. So yeah, that's the idea there, is that error patterns are another way of saying that error patterns are consistent with linguistic rules. Okay, so in the next lecture, we'll talk about Noam Chomsky's transformational grammar.